Hey guys, what is going on? Shah here, and today we're going to do something that actually one of you recommended to me, and that is comparing tanks and healers and seeing which ones are compatible for each other and which ones aren't so much. So later in the video, I'll refer these as more of synergetic healers. We have neutral healers, and then we have kind of friction healers that some tanks actually cause some friction with some of the healers. The goal of this video is essentially to give you guys an idea for those who are creating a composition with some of your friends on what the best tank to healer maybe kind of meta or composition might be, whether you're trying to go for a perfect meta comp or you're just trying to look for a healer and a tank that work well together. This is hopefully going to give you some options, and if you're a pug player, this might give you an insight on maybe what healers to maybe steer away from, or maybe what healers you might want to look out for, and hopefully that this down the road will give you a group maybe in the future that you can actually start pushing some mythic plus with. So to keep that all in mind, this video is going to be breaking down the toolkit of each tank, how they mitigate damage, what kind of utility that the tank brings, and what kind of defensive cooldowns. And then we're going to be looking at healers and kind of the healing profile of said healer, the utility that they bring, and the cooldowns that they bring. And then we're going to be looking at how the healers compare to, or how the healers contrast with each other, and comparing what tanks suit them best and vice versa. So I hope this video helps, but we're going to dive right in. So I've created an Excel document kind of just laying out in the most simplistic sense on what the toolkit looks like for each of the tanks. Now, I'm going to share this down in the description of this YouTube video, so you guys will be able to actually check this out if you want to refer back to it later or while you're watching this video. So I am looking at tanks in the most objective sense, meaning I'm not taking into account many talents, though sometimes there are talents that you're probably going to want to take. And I'm kind of steering away from covenant choices, legendaries, and things like that. I just want to look at the raw toolkit that each tank brings, because when you get all these other borrowed powers in and talent choices is when the waters get a little murky. So that's my reasoning for some of these things looking like fairly short. So feel free in the comment section below to list other things that the class might bring if I missed anything, but that's where my stance is, and that's why I laid this out the way I did. So I have three sections here. I have mitigation, damage reduction, and defensives, and I have utility. So we're going to start with Protection Warrior. This is in no particular order. This is not a tier list of any sort. This is just trying to contrast the different tanks and what healers they might pair best with. So mitigation for Warriors is pretty straightforward. You have your main mitigation, which is shield block, and you have 2 charges of this on a fairly short cooldown, though you're not going to be able to keep 100% uptime. On top of this, you'll also have Ignore Pain, which is a kind of a pseudo damage absorption. It doesn't absorb all the damage you're taking, but this can help mitigate some of that magic damage you might be taking or some large hits. Now, this does go up to a certain threshold, but Shield Block and Ignore Pain together make for a pretty sturdy tank. So how do they counter those times where they're out of charges and they might not have Rage to keep Ignore Pain up the whole time? They're going to be cycling in some of their damage reductions and defensives like Shield Wall, Last Stand, and Spell Reflect. Now, I was a little torn on putting Spell Reflect in the utility category. I think it's actually more used as a defensive, especially how the damage profiles of a lot of the dungeons are looking. I think I know I already mentioned I'm not going to be including legendaries, but there is a Spell Reflect legendary that's group wide for Protection Warriors, and if you're running that, I think it would be more utility based than anything. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at this. Third, we have utility. In the utility category, I'm going to be including everything from group stuns to CC to group AoE, maybe defensive reductions or group damage reductions, and small utilities like that, including dispels and battle res and everything like that. So if I did miss anything, please let me know, but I'm trying to keep this as restricted to the general toolkit as possible. So Warriors bring Shockwave, which is a group AoE stun. They bring Commanding Shout, which is a good utility for bolstering up the health pool of your allies to help mitigate some of that incoming damage. It can have some negative effects, so keep that in mind. Challenging Shout is a mass taunt ability, which can be good if you lose aggro. Intervene can be used as a slight damage reduction on some of your allies. Then you also have Intimidating Shout, which is a fear, which can be used to interrupt spell casts or any kind of ability that you might see going out. So that pretty much wraps up the Protection Warrior toolkit. Now, the next couple tanks, because I've already laid out mitigation or the different categories that we're going to be looking at, I'm going to blow through these pretty quickly. So unlike Warrior, Guardian Druids have stacks of mitigation, and their tankiness or sturdiness depends on how many stacks they're going to be able to have. And then when they do get low on health, they're going to counter this with Frenzied Regeneration, which does have 2 charges but this is essentially not only a percentage of their health heal, but it also increases the healing that they're going to be taking during the duration of that frenzied regen, which lasts for 3. They have Barkskin, which is a fairly short cooldown that does a small damage reduction. They have 2 survival instinct charges, which is a 50% damage reduction wall, and then they have Berserk or Incarnation if they do decide to take that talent choice. And when it comes to utility, unlike Warrior, or I guess in addition to Warrior, they bring a lot more. They have Restoration Affinity, or any of their affinities, really. I don't know why I put Resto Affinity here. You could take Balance Affinity and you could take Feral Affinity, respectively, but Resto Affinity is typically the choice, so you bring off healing with that. You also have Rebirth, which is a battle res, which is pretty much needed in most circumstances in Mythic Plus, so it's always a good thing to have that, especially on the tank. Entangling Roots or Mastered, if also is taken as a talent, could be good utility for kiting or maybe spiteful mobs, for example. I found that to be incredibly useful during that affix. You have Incapacitating Roar, Stampeding Roar as a movement speed increase. Hibernate can be used in some circumstances. I definitely spelled that wrong. Hold on, guys. Hibernate. I don't want to end up on Max's stream again. We also have a Soothe, which is an Enrage Dispel, and then we have Remove Corruption, which can dispel hexes and poison. So very, very useful in a lot of circumstances when you don't have a Shaman or a Resto Druid present. So moving on, we have Brewmaster. Brewmaster mitigates damage in a different way than a lot of the other tanks. It is kind of all generated into their stagger, which is a passive. So instead of taking damage up front, they're going to be taking damage over time. And the way that they mitigate this immense amount of damage if it gets to a higher amount of stagger is they use Purifying Brew, which does have 2 charges, and this essentially cuts their stagger down by a percentage. So this is how they're going to be mitigating damage. Their damage reduction, I was tempted to put Slusher Brew as a damage mitigation, but I think it's more of a defensive cooldown. Feel free to disagree with me on this. This was an ability that I was kind of torn on putting in either category, but for the sake of this, I'm going to actually keep it in damage reduction. You can also invoke the Black Ox, which reduces the stagger you take and reduces damage taken in a kind of a pseudo DR, because it's transferring the damage you're taking to the Black Ox. So it's kind of like a 25% damage reduction, I guess, if you want to consider it that. They also have Fortifying Brew, which is another DR, and then they have Zen Med. I put a question mark here because Zen Med is a pretty big DR. It's 60% damage reduction. It's a fairly long cooldown, and if you get autoed, it gets canceled. So this is a problem with this. So this is good to counter like bursting stacks or kind of like AoE affixes or damaging abilities in certain boss fights. But for the most part, if you do take a physical hit, a melee hit, this will cancel. It is a channeled ability. They have a fair bit of utility. They have Ring of Peace, which is an area of denial effect for enemy mobs. They have Paralysis, which can be used to interrupt casts or to CC mobs out of packs. Mystic Touch, of course, brings an increased physical damage, so this is really good if you're running melee cleaves. You have Transcendence for kiting, you have Leg Sweep, which is an AoE stun, and then of course Detox, which can remove poisons or diseases, which is pretty useful this expansion as we've seen so far. So with Blood DK is a little bit unique as well because they don't mitigate a lot of damage. They do have Marrow Rend, which applies Bone Shield stacks, which increases their armor, but outside of that, they're going to be taking a lot more damage up front. But how do they counter this? They counter it with Deathstrike, and Deathstrike does have a resource cost, which is Runic Power. Runic Power has to be generated by spending runes. Most of the time, they're fairly good on this, and they don't really run out of this resource. But if they do find themselves in that kind of situation, they have several defensives to use. Like Rune Tab, which is a DR. They have Anti-Magic Shell, which is Absorption Shield for magic damage. Icebound Fortitude is their wall. They have Lichborn, which increases their leech. Same with Vamp Blood, increases their maximum health and their leech. And then Dancing Rune Weapon, which increases their parry chance. So they have a lot of answers to a lot of different situations. Compared to a lot of the other tanks, they have pretty much the biggest list here. When it comes to utility, they don't have as much, and if you guys remember, I talked about how they're more of a selfish tank, and this is why I think they're a little bit more selfish, because if you look at this kind of utility compared to that of a Druid or Protection Paladin's utility, they have a lot less comparatively, but they still have some good utilities nonetheless. So they have Anti-Magic Zone, which is a group-wide magic damage reduction. Death Grip and Gorfine's Grasp are kind of one and the same, but can be used to control mobs, and of course they have a Battle Res, which is very practical. And again, I am leaving like legendaries and stuff out of this and different borrowed power systems, so there can be more added to this list, but again, looking at the base toolkit of these tanks, this is what they have. Moving on, we're almost done here. So Protection Paladin, they have another kind of different way of mitigating, but instead of having charges, they have a resource cost on both of their mitigation tactics. Typically, you'll want to spend their resource that they have is called Holy Power. Their Holy Power has to be spent on either Shade of the Righteous or Ward of Glory, and it's either an armor increase or a heal, which heals for almost their full health if it crits, or it's 300% of the heal on top of their missing health, which can be fairly powerful. And when they don't have these mitigations up, or when they're taking a lot of damage, their answers to this are Ardent Defender, which is a smaller DR, but it's also a cheap death if used at the right time. Avenging Wrath, of course, can increase the healing that they're doing, so this in turn is a pseudo damage reduction, or I guess a defensive as well as an offensive. Guardian of Ancient Kings, of course, and then Divine Shield if they're in a tight spot. Now, Divine Shield will drop aggro unless they're talented with the right talent that can cause it to be a mass taunt, but I am using it as a defensive here because sometimes that may be the case. And then, of course, utility, they bring Devo Aura, which is a group-wide damage reduction. Blessing of Freedom, Blessing of Protection, Lay on Hands, Blessing of Sacrifice. So their blessings in Lay on Hand are insanely fun to use. Blinding Light can be used as a CC. If you might take Repentance, but normally Blinding Light is a choice. And, of course, they can cleanse toxins, so poisons. And diseases, of course. Lastly, we have Vengeance. Again, similar to Warrior, they have Demon Spike Charges, which is, they have 2 of these, which is lowered by haste. And during these windows where they're not able to mitigate their damage using Demon Spikes, they'll use Soul Cleave to heal themselves back. And this is a resource cost with both Fury and having Soul Fragments. Or Soul Fragments, I guess, is an additional resource cost. The more you have, the more it's going to heal for. When it comes to damage reduction or their cooldowns, they don't have much. Metamorphosis is a very, very powerful cooldown, where Fell Devastation is kind of like a pseudo mini cooldown, and it's on a 1-minute cooldown, and it gives them a fair bit of healing, and it expels a lot of shards for you to be able to soul cleave with. And then Fiery Brand is a single target damage reduction, so not as powerful as like things like Ardent Defender or like Rune Tap or like Barkskin, but Fiery Brand is still good on single target encounters. When it comes to utility, they have their sigils, they have Imprison, they have an offensive purge, and of course Chaos Brand for caster cleaves is always very beneficial. And then the rare occasion where you want to use Spectral Sight to find out where stealth mobs are located, or in PvP, of course, if you're doing that, but this isn't towards PvP, so we're going to ignore that. Spectral Sight can be fairly useful there. So that is a full breakdown of all of the tanks and how they're working, from their mitigation to their damage reduction to utility. So let's jump over to the healers to figure out what their toolkits might bring. So when looking at healers, there are a few things that I want to keep in mind for this video. I wanted to kind of break down their healing profile in the most objective sense as I possibly could. Let me know if I am wrong on these, because I don't main healer, or I haven't mained healer for a very long time, especially in Mythic Plus. I mainly tank. So I'm going to be covering their healing profile, their cooldowns, and their utility, of course. So let's start with Restoration Shaman. So with Restoration Shaman, we're looking at a healer who has a fair bit of burst healing, but it does require setup. They have minor sustained healing through things like Riptide and Healing Rain, and as well as some of their totems. And they're fairly mana efficient for the most part, unless they're under a lot of stress, but most healers under a lot of stress will expunge a lot of mana. When it comes to cooldowns, they have a fair bit. A few of them are talents, but they have Healing Tide, it's a heal that, or it's a cooldown that typically scales better into larger group content, of course, but it can be used as a way to passively heal the group to kind of increase your healing, especially if you're falling into like a Cloudburst totem of some sort. You also have Spirit Link, which is a very powerful group cooldown. It basically creates all of your health pool into one. This can be a good cooldown, a very, very powerful cooldown, but it can also be a detriment to the group if you use it at the wrong time. If everyone's taking damage and you pop this, it could end up killing your tank, because they're not going to be able to fully top themselves off if they're a tank that can quickly top themselves off, like a Blood DK, for example, or a Vengeance Demon Hunter. This could end up hurting them. But still a strong cooldown, and of course Ascendance of Talented and Earthen Wall Totem is also a strong cooldown that they can use on a fairly short cooldown. So they also bring a fair bit of utility. They have Earthbind, which is a slow Earth Elemental, can be used to help tank mobs and mitigate some damage. They have Hex, can be used in some situations to interrupt cast or to leave mobs out of the pool if you're trying to deal with a certain amount of mobs instead of the entire pack itself. Incap Totem can be used as a group stun, can sometimes have some friction with other group members, like a monk with leg sweep can quickly cause things to have a diminishing return on them, or Havoc Demon Hunters. And they also have an offensive purge and a dispel that can dispel magic and hex. Restoration Druid is in a really good spot right now, and it always has been the best choice for mythic dungeon content. They have good sustained healing over time, which means they can kind of put up their hots for expected damage and ride out that wave, and it's very, very strong and suited and can cover most affixes. They have good burst healing as well through Swiftmend and other sources. There is a little bit of setup required. They have to know the damage profile of the dungeon, and in a coordinated group, rest of druids strive to be really good. But when you're pugging, I have found rest of druids a lot harder to play because people are taking unexpected damage because you're just not familiar with how the group plays. But they're fairly mana efficient, especially with like things like innervates. They're fairly mana efficient with that. Their cooldowns are a little bit smaller than maybe Shaman, but they have Tranquility, Incarnation of Talented, and Ironbark is a damage reduction cooldown that can be applied to members of their group. Utility, obviously their affinity choice. They do have a resurrect. They're the only healer that has a battle res, which is really, really, really strong. That's why it makes them so good. It's one of the many reasons. They have Entangling Roots and Mastery of Talented, Hibernates, and why do I spell this wrong every time? Hibernate. All right. My English professor would be so disappointed in me. They also have Soothe, which is an enrage, I guess a Soothe to an enrage. And then Remove Corruption can do magic and poison. So they have a fair bit in their toolkit. We then have Mistweaver Monk. Solid burst healing, good priority target healing, but little sustained healing. And they have pretty inefficient mana. They do have a lot of cooldowns, though. They have Life Cocoon, Revival, Invoke the Red Crane if Talented. Oh, and quickly going back to Revival, it is also a Mass Dispel in a way, so it could be good on bursting weeks. Thunder Focus Tea is pretty good as I would say it's like a minor cooldown, and then they have Invoke the Jade Serpent. So good cooldown here, but we also have good utility. We have Mana Tea, Ring of Peace, Paralysis, Mystic Touch, Transcendence, Leg Sweep, and Detox. A lot of these things you're going to see are similar to the counterpart tanks. So now we have Discipline Priests. They have how they work is essentially their damage is put into healing, or their damage equals their healing. So the more damage they can do, the more healing they can do based on atonements. They have really good burst healing, but they do lack recovery if things go unexpected. So if there's random people standing in Volcanic, or there's random damage that, like a missed kick on some kind of like Shadow Bolt volley of some sort, or Frostbolt volley, and they're very cooldown oriented. So they really require like Schism windows plus Radiance, and you're actually going to see that in their cooldowns. I listed it as kind of a source of their cooldown. They also have things like Pain Suppression, Power Word Barrier, and Rapture, all great cooldowns. Pain Suppression is really good for some tanks when they when they lack their charges, or a Guardian Druid going into pull, but we're going to get to that. And then they have a massive amount of utility. They have Power Infusion, Mass Dispel. They obviously bring Stamina, which is good in most circumstances outside of like Grievous Week. Fade to reduce threat, Leap of Faith, Dispel Magic, and Offensive Purge. Mind Control could be used in a lot of situations. We're still trying to figure some of that out, but there were some crazy uses for it in BFA. Shackle Undead. We are in the Shadowlands after all, so pretty good. And Purify Magic. Next, we do have Holy Paladin. So Holy Paladin has good on-demand burst healing, which could be good in a lot of situations. But they do have little to no healing over time effects, which can kind of punish them. Coming out of BFA, they were really strong healers because of their Glimmer, the potency of Glimmer. But coming into this expansion, they have to choose Glimmer as a talent, which may or may not be the choice, and it is a lot weaker. So they're really going to rely on their Holy Shocks and Avenging Wrath, and with that being said, they're very, very cooldown reliant. That Avenging Wrath cooldown is extremely vital for them. So with that being said, they have a few cooldowns. They have Avenging Wrath, or Mastery and Blessing of Sacrifice as a single target damage reduction, or I guess health transfer, if you'd want to call it that. Essentially, it's redirection of damage. And then the utility they bring, similar to Prop Paladins, they bring Devour, Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Freedom, Lay on Hands, Blinding Light, / Repentance, and Cleanse Magic. So a fair bit there. And I think that covers it. That's pretty much all the healers. I'm kidding. There's Holy Priest, right? So if you have Holy Priest, just play Discipline Priest. Of course, I'm going to get a lot of hate from some Holy Priest players out there. Holy Priest, their toolkit's just not designed for Mythic Plus, but I did whip up a quick list here. So they have incredibly strong throughput healing, and they have good burst healing with some of their Holy Words. The only thing about Holy Words is it's restricted to how many casts they can get off to get that cooldown reduction. So outside of their Holy Words, they lack some of that good burst healing. So if there's unexpected damage, similar to Disc Priest, they can suffer a little bit. They're pretty mana efficient, which is good, and they have a minor heal over time with Renew. They have a few cooldowns, but nothing that is going to help reduce damage. They have Guardian Spirit, which can increase the healing. They have Divine Hymn, which is also pretty strong in typically raid encounters, so it's not that great for keys, but it can put out a good amount of sustained healing. And Apotheosis is a good talent choice for Mythic Plus, and I think that's typically what people have ran in BFA, but correct me on that if I'm wrong. I more than likely am. And then lastly, very, very, if not the exact same toolkit as Discipline Priest. Something I forgot to put up here, but I just included down here, is Psychic Scream is also a good interrupt. So pretty strong toolkit coming out of Priest, but again, they just lack damage reduction and they lack good healing outside of their holy words. And they just have always scaled better into raid encounters. So not that holy priests aren't good, like they've always been good raid healers, especially when it comes to throughput and in throughput encounters. So lastly, we're gonna now compare. I know this has been a long video, but bear with me. I love those bear puns. So let's open this up and take a look. So I have the tanks listed at the top, and you guys could literally exit out of this video now, but just screenshot this and walk away. You guys already have the document, so you could have probably had spoilers. But you guys might want to hear the reasoning why I have them in these certain categories, so stick around for a little bit longer. So we're going to be starting with the Protection Warrior. Now, good healers that synergize well with them would be Resto Druid, Discipline Priest, and Holy Paladin. They bring good burst healing. They bring that sustained healing when they do lack those charges. They have good toolkits for some utility, and they just synergize well with Prot Warrior. And then the neutral healers would include Resto Shaman and Mist Weaver. These are healers that don't perform necessarily well. They can heal them, of course, but don't bring anything beneficial that complements a Prot Warrior toolkit. And Holy Priest, the friction with them is typically, like, again, they don't bring any damage reduction. Their DR, I'm like air quoting here. Actually, here, I'll pull this up. I'm air quoting their damage reduction through Guardian Spirit. It's not really DR. It benefits, like, increase the healing that they take, but then that all falls back on the Holy Priest having that healing ready for them to go. So, and then with that, like, Heroic Leap can get interrupted by Leap of Faith if used at the wrong time. So I just find that there's a little bit of friction between Prot Warrior and Holy Priest. So Guardian Druid, they don't really have a healer that they don't mesh well with. Maybe Resto Druid bring the second Battle Res, but honestly, having a second Battle Res in the group isn't an issue. If the Resto Druid dies, the Guardian Druid can grab a Battle Res, and vice versa. If there's a lot of damage going on and a DPS dies, like the Guardian Druid can grab it instead of the Resto Druid, because the Resto Druid's busy on keeping everyone alive. So, that might be the only friction, but outside of that, like, they mostly do really well, but they pair well with healers that have good on-demand burst healing to kind of fix their issue or, like, help fill in that hole that they have where they just take a lot of damage at the start of pulls. Brewmaster monks pair better with healers that do good healing over time or can do good burst healing to get them out of stagger. So Holy Paladin is in the neutral because just Brewmasters don't dip a lot, so a lot of their healing just goes into overhealing, which isn't great. And the reason that Holy Priests and Mistweavers are in the kind of friction category is Mistweaver toolkit is very, very identical to Brewmaster, and those things have a little bit of tension. And then Holy Priest, just same thing with Prot Warriors, like charges and transcendence can get those things can get messed up when it comes to like Leap of Faith being used. So it can, the playstyle of Brewmaster is very mobile, and Holy Priest can kind of build some tension around that, and it's not a good kind of tension. It's not sexual tension. Blood Decay, really most healers do well. Disc Priest, Mistweavers, and Resto Druids who have kind of on-demand burst healing, offer damage reductions, and can help them sustain and not punish their toolkit, pair a little bit better. But again, most things pair well with it. As you guys notice, most things that are synergizing and neutral, I'm kind of skipping over because it's kind of obvious, more or less. I guess friction is more important. The reason that Holy Paladin has friction with Prot Paladin is just because of blessings and forbearance and things like that. Can sometimes either waste globals or can screw over. Like if the Prot Paladin had that, he knew he was going to like Divine Shield taunt, but the Holy Paladin randomly like hit lay on hands on him to save him. Now the Prot Paladin can't use that to keep himself up and has no mitigation, and then everything kind of fumbles. So that's the reason that they're in this category down here. But most of the other healers do synergize fairly well with the Prot Paladin. And Vengeance Demon Hunter is one of those tanks that, similar to Guardian Druid, they just need a healer. Most of these guys bring a good toolkit that complements Vengeance Demon Hunter, and Vengeance Demon Hunter just doesn't have a lot in their toolkit. So any other class typically complements it fairly well because they bring things that the Vengeance Demon Hunter typically wouldn't. But Vengeance Demon Hunter bringing that increased magic damage, you're going to see like Resto Shaman, like Flame Shock, Chain Lightning, things like that. Resto Druid, like Moonfire, Sunfire, and Discipline Priest, just damage overall, is going to pair very well with the Vengeance Demon Hunter. That is pretty much the wrap of the video. Now, it is really long. I'm going to cut this down a little bit, but it'll still probably be like a 20-minute plus video. So thank you guys for watching the whole thing and sticking around. I hope this helped, and I hope it was fairly informative. This isn't necessarily a meta. This isn't supposed to say, oh, you know, Brewmaster Monk with Resto Druid is really, really good, despite it probably being really good. I just wanted to show what healers and what tanks kind of paired well together, or maybe better than others. So for those out there who are trying to figure out a composition, like myself with my group, trying to figure out the best composition that fits your goals. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you liked it. If you did, feel free to hit that like button, that subscribe button if you haven't yet, that notification bell for more content like this, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Take care.